Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Vertical Space, a podcast at the intersection of technology and flight. We are your hosts, Jim Barry, Peter Shannon, and Luka Tomjanovic, and here we look at the most important forces shaping the market of advanced air mobility with a particular focus on why and how they matter to those building a business in this very exciting and growing industry.
We really want to understand demand patterns and what is the right pricing strategy in terms of how this type of a service operates. So we've actually taken the set of tools that I developed at Uber Elevate as part of the deal when Elevate was acquired by Joby, and really have doubled down in developing these, both in terms of the data sources that we bring into it and then our actual analytic capability to really look at pretty fine-grained detailed simulations of different markets of interest that we have.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Vertical Space and our talk with Joby's head of product, Allison. I think you're really going to enjoy this discussion. Of course, we talk about Joby's vehicle design, its sizing, and its requirements. Now listen, how often do you get a chance to talk to a person of Eric's experience and background to hear how and why they designed the vehicle they did, given the anticipated market demand? It's great hearing the use cases and the requirements that drove the Joby design. You'll hear a common theme throughout the podcast. Eric and Joby's constant focus on minimizing aircraft noise, which they believe is so important for customer and community acceptance. Eric makes it clear that low noise just doesn't come along with electric airplanes, and that Joby's focus on acoustic signature from day one is a competitive advantage and a transformational capability. We also have a good discussion on the overall market and how Joby is bringing the aircraft and the product and service to market. We also, of course, discuss certification and the value of a piloted vehicle in the certification process. And we get to hear Eric's opinion with his vast background on the future of fully autonomous operations. Our discussion on the cost of operation is a good one, where they are developing what they believe to be the right pricing strategies based on demand patterns. We discuss the right price targets that will drive the utilization Joby requires, and how they plan to start with roughly Uber Black-like pricing and hope to eventually achieve Uber X-like pricing. And listen to the weather conditions they plan to initially operate in. Listen, Eric is an articulate and informed industry leader. He clearly stays on message, and he provides a compelling vision for not only the overall market, but for Joby as well. We thank Eric for joining us, and to our listeners, we hope you enjoy our talk with Allison as you innovate in the vertical space.
This episode of the Vertical Space podcast is brought to you by Avionics. Avionics is the leader in low size, weight, and power certified avionics for manned, unmanned, and advanced air mobility aircraft. Let Avionics help you achieve your goals, whether that be type certification, airspace access, or beyond visual line of sight operations. Avionics has certified and certifiable communications, navigation, and surveillance avionics for your aircraft. So head over to uavionics.com or Google it to see how you can start flying safer and move your platform forward into shared airspace.
Allison serves as Joby's head of product. He most recently led the Elevate team at Uber, developing software tools that built on more than a decade of experience enabling on-demand mobility. His experience in aerospace research, electric propulsion, energy storage, vehicle autonomy, and composite structures led him to the CEO position at Z-Aero, where he spearheaded the development of Cora, an autonomous air taxi vehicle. Eric holds a PhD in aeronautics and astronautics from Stanford, as well as an MS in aeronautics and astronautics from Stanford, and a BS from the Milwaukee School of Engineering. Allison, thank you so much for joining us on the Vertical Space. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's fantastic to join you all today.
First of all, before we get into it, congratulations on the new Air Force contract, $55 million contract I saw today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We're really excited about this, that the partnership with DoD has been kind of a long time in the making. And we started several years ago working with DIU and with Agility Prime, and just really excited to be able to continue that partnership and have this new contract that we're able to share with everyone.
We got to ask our first question. Is there anything that very few in the industry agree with you on?
I've been thinking about this question, and I don't know if people don't agree with me or if it's just underappreciated, but I think that there's this conception in the industry that noise or low noise comes for free once you go electric. and that, okay, I've got this electric airplane, it's going to be quiet. And that's really not true. That there is a lot of work and a lot of engineering that goes into making an aircraft quiet. Electric is an enabler. I think it's a necessary but not sufficient technology to really make something that's transformational from an acoustic perspective.
So, Eric, that's an interesting point. I mean, I love the emphasis that Joby places on how quiet you are. And you know that one of the market hurdles for all of these aircraft is going to be the environmental concerns and the community's reception to the visual aircraft, as well as the noise from the aircraft. And so what you're saying is that even though there'll be other electric and hybrid eVTOLs out there that'll be accessing, let's say, New York City, what you're saying is that you have a distinct advantage on the noise side, even though you may all be electric, for example. You have a distinct advantage on the noise side for whatever reason. So why do you have an advantage?
You have to make noise a priority from the beginning of the design process. It's not something you can just add at the end. You can't go through an overall design and design your motors and design your powertrain, design the overall configuration of the aircraft, and then make it quiet. You have to include noise, acoustic signature up front as a fundamental constraint in the design process. And it's a difficult constraint. It's difficult to simulate. It requires a lot of testing and iteration. And that's what Joby's really done over the last 10 plus years. It made that noise constraint a priority from the very beginning. And that's driven the investment in the actual technology to make an airplane with an acoustic signature that is remarkable possible because of that investment that we've made.
Eric, we'll get to the product in a little bit, but how about we start with the market? Can you give us a sense of how has the urban air mobility use case changed since the 2016 days at Uber Elevate and the famous white paper? What are some of the early assumptions that still hold true, and which ones proved to be wrong?
Yeah, I actually think looking back at the Elevate white paper, it's pretty remarkable how well it's held up. The fundamental value proposition of urban air mobility is pretty much just as we laid out in that white paper. The idea that traffic and congestion in cities is getting worse, the idea that communities are going to care about quiet and environmentally friendly solutions to traffic, and that aerial mobility can provide those solutions in this way, I think is only grown stronger the case. I think that we were a little aggressive on timing, but I think if we weren't aggressive on timing, it wouldn't have helped push the whole industry forward. So I think that it was the right thing to do. But I think that it's been remarkably durable. And if you look at all the companies in the space, including Joby, largely are pursuing that vision of what we can bring to the world with this technology.
What was it about timing that proved out to be the most flimsy assumption?
Well, I think that you always set aggressive timelines on things and then push toward it. And so when the Elevate white paper was written, I think that we had put out, I mean, I wasn't at Elevate when the white paper was actually published. So I was one of the reviewers of it in my previous position. The idea of a 2023 entry into service was one of the fundamental things in the white paper. And I think that's proved to not be the case.
What hurdles have come about, since the white paper that were not anticipated back in 2016?
Again, I think all of the basic elements were laid out. I think that one of the hurdles that we definitely need to clear, I guess, in the right metaphor, is the one of community acceptance, and that we have to be able to engage with communities and educate about the value and the opportunities this type of mobility provides. And there's work to do there, and that's going to be really important to launch and invest in a small number of cities initially, and really show the promise and the benefit that this technology holds.
That's a terrific point. So we talked about noise earlier. There's also the visual noise that the community is going to be concerned about, aren't they? Especially for you to get to the scale you need to be at to be able to hit the financial projections you're looking at. There's going to be a lot of planes in the air. How are you addressing both types of noise?
So we're really focused on the acoustic signature of the airplane, like I mentioned earlier, and with the way we've been able to design our propellers and the powertrain that drives the propellers, when our aircraft's flying over a community at a typical cruising altitude, we'll be under the background noise in most urban environments. And we published some videos back in 2021, actually, that tried to show this and illustrate both the character of the noise, broadband dominated noise versus tonal noise that's typical in aircraft and helicopters, but also just the overall kind of way it sounds and the loudness as a result. And so we're really excited by that. And we think that's a transformational capability that basically no aircraft have right now. From a visual standpoint, the sky is actually pretty big. And as aircraft get further from the ground, and if you look at the actual visual impact of aircraft and frequent operations, I actually think that is less of a concern to me than getting the acoustic signature right, because I think that's been proven to be a major community concern across the board.
Have you met with communities yet, Eric? Has Joby reached out? And if you have, what's the initial feedback to your vehicle and to your deployment?
Yeah, we've engaged with communities in a number of different places, and we have a really strong team that continues to do that on a daily basis. We're just really encouraged by the excitement that communities have for this technology. I think there's something about the idea of this type of travel that just captivates the imagination of people. And to be able to do it in a way that has this low environmental footprint, whether or not it's the zero emissions on route or this low acoustic signature, is almost magical. And people are really captivated by that and excited about seeing this come to their communities.
You mentioned one of the assumptions back in the Uber Elevate days that timing was aggressive. That was about 7 years ago. So if we assume we're 7 years into the future, looking back to today, what is going to be one of the assumptions or a couple of assumptions that we were overly optimistic around?
So I wish I could predict the future like that. But I don't know if I knew the assumptions we were being optimistic on, I would not be optimistic on that. I do think that when I look forward, 5-10 years and think about how the things that have to happen for this market to develop and for this technology to play out, what we have to see is investment into, like I mentioned, several initial key markets where we actually are able to demonstrate the way this technology works and the way this service actually provides benefits to communities. And as we do that, we will be able to build additional scale in those communities and then start to expand into more places to provide this same type of service in many different communities, because we know that there are places all over the world, not just in the US, that could benefit from this type of increased mobility by being able to move through the third dimension in the air.
So as you develop the product, the S4 aircraft that is going through certification, what turned out to be the most difficult technology or subsystem to develop?
So maybe I'm a broken record on this today, but the acoustics is really kind of one of the linchpin technologies and quite challenging. That we know that this, in order to realize the market that we believe exists, you have to get the acoustics right, and you have to get the signature of this airplane to be compatible with the communities that we want to deploy into. And so we really spent quite a lot of time and quite a lot of effort on the acoustics to be able to deliver a product to our future customers that we think they're going to really welcome in their communities.
When we think about developing the product, bringing it to market, certification is a key hurdle, and certification is based upon safety and operations. And within that scope, what have been the key hurdles? What are the assumptions that the team has brought into that? And I think when you consider that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the decision to go with a piloted vehicle versus others that are choosing autonomous from day one.
So I think that is actually one of the really key decisions, that we're designing this aircraft to be certifiable within the system that exists today, and we're deep in the certification process at this point, and that means that we have designed it to have a pilot on board inside the airplane, flying the airplane from the inside, and that's a really key assumption that then a lot of other things get built around in terms of how we're doing it. So that was one of the fundamental decisions that we made early on. That was the fastest way to get to the market. There's a lot of work that goes into certifying an aircraft. So we don't have concerns on our certification path. We've actually been, the FAA has provided more clarity and we're working very, very closely with them on a daily basis to drive forward our certification process. But there's a lot of work that goes into that. It's all about the details. It's about doing the many detailed tests that have to be done to build the overall package of information that goes into an aircraft certification. And so, we've been pretty transparent as to where we are in that process, and we've completed 2 of the 5 stages of certification that we've laid out. Excited about the progress that we've made on the 3rd, and excited about the progress we've made on our pilot manufacturing as well, which is then has to kind of come in parallel, so that we're able to start producing certified aircraft as the type certification finishes.
It comes with the territory of being an early pioneer, but when you're bringing to market something that has not been validated in real life operations, it's always there an element of uncertainty as to how customers will ultimately adopt it. So given that this is the first generation of aircraft that you're bringing to market, how resilient is the current design to unanticipated changes in the market?
We think we've designed the right aircraft for the market in the sense of the work that we've done on understanding who the potential users are and what are the use cases, and how this type of an aircraft could be woven into the transportation system as it exists today. So, we have 4 revenue seats in the airplane. We think that the speed and the range are right to give us flexibility in how we operate the aircraft in different potential segments of the market. And so we feel pretty good about that in terms of where we're going to end up when we actually are able to start commercial operations. One of the reasons that we have a lot of confidence in this as well is some of the work that I did previously with Uber Copter. So this is a product that we launched at Uber Elevate back in 2019, where we were actually testing this out in real life, where we had an actual live product using helicopters, because that's the only certified vertical lift machine available right now. And we were actually able to offer this service up until the pandemic, and really start to understand what the way customers interacted with this. And this was in Lower Manhattan to JFK was the route that we were operating on, kind of making it as simple a problem as possible, and really started to understand that there's a lot of interesting customer learnings that come from actually having paying customers doing this on a regular basis. And we were pretty excited about the results that we had and the opportunity, what it implies for the future service with the Joby aircraft that we're developing.
And as head of product, how much of your time is dedicated thinking about the product roadmap and iteration of products in the future? Can you give us a sense of what this product roadmap looks like?
Yeah, so the way I define the product is actually the service that we're delivering to people. So I spend a lot of time thinking about that piece of it. How do we actually deliver this commercial service to our future customers? And what does that imply on what the airplane has to do? But that's the aircraft's in certification. And so a lot of those decisions have been made already, and I think are the right decisions that we made, that have so that element of the product, the aircraft element, is a very, very obviously key piece of it. But we have a lot of work that we're doing on what does it mean to put that in front of the customer? What does it mean to integrate this service into Uber? What does it mean to integrate it into Delta, 2 of our big partners on the demand side of things? And actually, build this magical trip experience that our customers will be able to use on a daily basis.
Eric, as you think about the commercialization of the aircraft, I've been reading through your 10K, and you've checked off a couple of the really necessary elements of making sure this is successful. So one of the huge ones would be noise. We were talking to an industry analyst on a podcast probably about 6 months ago, and I was singing the praises of advanced air mobility. And I'm on the coast in Connecticut, and I was saying, how great it'll be that I'm going to be able to take an aircraft from where I am to JFK and avoid all the horrible traffic going into New York. And he kind of stopped me dead, and he said, Jim, the cost of these aircraft will be so significant. It'll be a very small group of people who will be able to do what you're hoping to do. I know that, for example, you're targeting $3 a seat mile. Is $3 written on your wall saying, guys, whatever we do, we got to make sure at scale we can be at $3 a seat mile? How important is that as you think about the building of the aircraft and of the commercialization of the service?
Yeah, let me answer that by kind of, in some ways, flipping it around. We really want to understand demand patterns and what is the right pricing strategy in terms of how this type of a service operates. So we've actually taken the set of tools that I developed at Uber Elevate as part of the deal when Elevate was acquired by Joby, and really have doubled down in developing these, both in terms of the data sources that we bring into it and then our actual analytic capability to really look at pretty fine-grained detailed simulations of different markets of interest that we have, that we can really understand what it looks like under different scenarios to deploy this type of a service in exactly the type of a way you just described, about being able to go to the airport on routes that otherwise are horrifically laden with traffic. And how do you do that in a way that you can make the whole network work and that you can drive utilization and load factor in such a way that you can hit some of those the price targets that we have? I think that we're going to be able to launch this service at Uber Black-like pricing per seat mile. And so we're thinking of it as a per seat product as opposed to a per vehicle product. But and I think that as we're able to drive utilization and really those are the two key things: driving utilization and driving load factor by developing the network over time, we're then able to come down from Uber Black-like pricing to something more like Uber X pricing. And I think that's the way we think about this problem. That how do we drive from kind of that lower load factor, lower utilization state of a more in the initial launch toward those more high utilization, high load factor situations.
Eric, if you do come into the market at that Uber Black type of pricing, what type of manufacturing scale and geographic footprint rollout do you anticipate having to have in order to meet the demand, if indeed you are able to offer it that type of attractive pricing?
I think that we haven't offered guidance on beyond like what we've talked about in our filings in the past. So I can't really comment too much on that. But we do, obviously we have to match the overall ramp up of our manufacturing capabilities with the deployment and rollout that we have. And so we spend a lot of time on that and understanding what the timing synergies are between the way we see the rollout happening and the way we're ramping up our manufacturing.
Who is this initial target customer segment? Who are they? How do they move today? What are their mobility patterns? How much do they spend on their mobility needs? Can you talk a little bit more about who those people are?
I think one of the advantages that we have in this space is that there are, with ride sharing kind of existing at scale across the entire world, basically, we have an understanding of the people that are using on-demand transportation on a daily basis. And so we really think that we fit into that overall picture of on-demand mobility. But what we bring to the table, which is what it's so exciting to have a partnership with someone like Uber and with Delta, is that we bring a capability that you just can't get any other way right now. I like to use the example of if you're up in the Marina district in San Francisco and you want to go to San Jose, it doesn't matter what type of car you book, if it's a premium SUV or if it's a shared ride, it's going to take you about the same amount of time to get there. There's just no other option. But having a new form of mobility that actually provides a real benefit in terms of a metric that people care about, which is saving their time for those types of trips, it's really exciting. And the people that use on-demand mobility today, we believe, and have done quite a lot of work in looking at with surveys and trying to understand the market, we think are going to be excited to use this new form of mobility that lets them do those same types of trips that they do on a regular basis, but do them much, much faster and frankly, a lot more fun too.
So as you think about the piloted vehicle and the cost associated with the piloted vehicle, and you think about the markets, let's just say within the United States today, that are Uber Black-like pricing, as you mentioned, how many markets are there in the US where you could achieve Uber Black-like pricing at reasonable utilization rates with a piloted vehicle?
We think there are many markets that can benefit from this service under that model, our initial launch model. We're really going to focus on a few to start with and really start to develop there and roll out our service in a way that really provides value to our future customers. But we know that there are lots of places in the US and places around the world that have all of the same characteristics: lots of congestion, takes way too much time to get in a lot of places that people want to go and have robust demand for ride sharing today that we think are great candidates for our technology.
And what weather conditions do you anticipate being able to operate the aircraft in, or the entire taxi service?
Yeah, we're going to launch initially VFR. And so we understand that will provide in certain markets limitations. And so that's frankly factors into the way we're looking at what our initial launch markets are. And then we plan to add IFR additional capabilities to the aircraft in subsequent upgrades to it.
Eric, explain a little bit about your vertically integrated approach. Pretty unique. What makes it novel? What are you most excited about?
So I think it's a really important fundamental piece of what we're doing is that we're doing it vertically integrated. And I like to think of it as we're upwardly vertically integrated and we're downwardly vertically integrated. And we're producing lots of critical parts and technology ourselves, and we plan to operate this. And what this really creates is this beneficial connection between all of these different pieces of the business. You could think of the data flow actually as representative of this. And we will produce certified aircraft out of our factories. They'll go into service in our operation. Our operation will operate these vehicles. The data that the vehicles generated will be collected, and we'll have that directly connected back into the manufacturing organization so that they can see what's going on without any friction or barriers between these things. And that will then inform us in terms of designing upgraded parts or the way we do maintenance, the way we think about predictive maintenance. There's all sorts of synergies that start to come from that as we think about connecting all of these pieces together with a single unified backend. And that's what we're building to be able to do this. And so I really think that it's the right way to bring this to market, because the technology just doesn't exist in the supply chain in a lot of cases that kind of meets both the rigorous quality and safety standards that we have, which is why we started inventing it in the first place over a decade ago. And there's also not an existing network to deploy these aircraft into. And so we know that we need to create that. And in doing so, then we can build that full picture, though, and connect all those pieces together, really capture value across the entire spectrum of what we're building.
Eric, how have you seen the evolution or the maturation of the supply chain over the last 3, 4, 5 years?
We work with a number of suppliers on different kind of pieces of the aircraft that we don't think need to fit into our core competency. And a perfect example is our work with Garmin. So I've been really excited to be able to work with Garmin to outfit our aircraft with avionics, and so they're a fantastic partner to have. Fundamentally, as we look to the broader supply chain, again, we don't see great alternatives to what we're doing ourselves. I think the value that you create when you build this type of an aircraft is that you build this tightly integrated system. And as a result, you really understand all of these pieces. We have experts in all of the different aspects of what we're creating. And as we go through the certification process, and as we have to demonstrate through tests all of the critical test points that we have to that are part of the certification process, having that expertise in-house, fully in the loop, we think is an incredible advantage, and it's going to pay dividends as we work with FAA and as we work through the really detailed testing phase of the certification process.
Eric, you're describing everything in superlatives almost, and you're happy about every single part of your strategy. What are some of the pieces that you have less comfort in, where you have more uncertainty, that you still need to get more validation from the market, from the industrial partners, from the supply chain?
Well, when it comes to certification, we can only move as fast as the FAA, right? And we've actually been encouraged that they are moving pretty fast. We're impressed that they're leaning in, but that's an externality that we can't control. We can only do our part in terms of engaging and working really hard at this. When it comes to deploying the aircraft, we think a major limiting factor is going to be takeoff and landing infrastructure. And that's something that we're excited to be working pretty hard on, looking at individual sites across different markets. We really think of infrastructure in 3 buckets: kind of existing aviation infrastructure that can be that's perhaps underutilized today that can be used more efficiently with this new technology. We think of converted infrastructure, the things like parking garages that may be underutilized, that we can convert the upper floors to be takeoff and landing areas. And then we think about greenfield infrastructure that comes further down the line, I believe. And so that there's a lot of work to be done on that to bring the right amount of infrastructure online in a time frame that fits with the deployment goals that we have. And so it's something that we're hard at work on.
With the first aircraft and initial manufacturing scale, what is the company's thinking with really the question, why go initially to a consumer mobility offering? And how do you think about the strategy that could be more vertically focused, focusing on higher value missions, as we see some other companies looking at?
I think we have laid out the vision of what we want to do in terms of this product, that we think there's an incredible value to be brought to mobility, to transportation, by offering an air taxi. And we've oriented the whole company around this, and that's what we're doing. So we think we have the right aircraft with the right characteristics to really make to open up this market, and to make this idea that many people have talked about for a long time, of being able to, on a regular basis, move through the third dimension to get to where you want to go, a reality in a pretty short time frame.
We had I loved your answer to Lucas' questions about, what's a little bit of what keeps you awake at night, maybe not that extreme, but, where finding places where to land. And we had a guest on earlier in the podcast that talked about New York City, and he talked about helicopters, for example. And he said, I'm losing landing spots today. I'm not gaining more. So once you get the certification hurdle, and it looks like you guys are making great progress, that'll probably be the next hurdle where your business model actually requires you to operate in big cities. And those landing spots will be essential. Now, there'll always be the air traffic challenges of, the urban air mobility, and there will always be noise, but I think you've gotten noise pretty well licked. I mean, better than probably just about anybody. But that where to land is going to be quite the challenge for you to be able to scale the way you need to scale to get the price where you need it. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Anything else you'd like to share about what you're doing about reducing that risk for your shareholders?
Well, I think they're coupled, right? So I think that question of noise and the takeoff and landing locations are really heavily coupled. The reason why it's hard, if not impossible, in certain areas to put in new helicopter infrastructure is because of the noise problem. And I think that the only way to open up new opportunities there is to have something that's a step change in terms of that critical characteristic. And so I think that that's what we're bringing to the table. And that's why we're excited about the opportunities there, because we know that that's the key unlock.
Let's talk a little bit, Eric, about batteries. So there have been people who have said, hybrid's probably the best way to go for a variety of reasons. In order for you to execute let's say your 5-year plan, what does battery technology have to be able to evolve to? Or is the existing batteries, is that sufficient for you to be able to execute your plan?
Yeah, the existing technology is sufficient for us to be able to deploy and start to scale this. I think that as battery technology improves, there's a couple of different things that can happen. The most obvious one, I think, is that you can simply extend the range of aircraft and grow the total addressable market, essentially, on the longer end of range as battery technology matures. I think that there are other step change technologies that can come into play there down the road. But for the air taxi market, one of the fundamental characteristics is it's really biased in terms of demand toward shorter range trips. And so what you can do if you have a larger battery, for example, is you can do more trips with less charging, so you can reduce some of the overhead and the turn times. Though we've really designed our aircraft to be able to be fast charged during the loading and unloading phases of the aircraft and be able to continuously operate in that way. But I think that it's really key that for your listeners to understand that battery technology is good enough to do this mission today. We've demonstrated 150 miles of range with our pre-production prototype that we talked about a couple of years ago, and that's using today's technology.
Eric, what are your thoughts on the timeline of implementing autonomy? The strategy of launching with pilots on board, some may say that you really will never be able to displace them with autonomy, whether this is for technical reasons, regulatory, or just business reasons in general. What are your thoughts on this evolution?
So I do think autonomy will play a factor down the road. I don't know when. I think there's some very optimistic projections out there in terms of when autonomy will be certifiable for this type of a vehicle. I don't know that anyone really has a sound basis to make those projections at this point. I think we'll see kind of incremental advances. I think it's worth pointing out that you still can't fly, small UAS outside of line of sight in most situations. Now there's starting to be a little bit more of that. But it's been many, many years that we've been talking about this, and there still isn't really a big unlock in that direction. So I think that our approach of starting with a pilot in the aircraft is very much been validated by events that in the way that the kind of regulatory landscape has played out. We certainly pay pretty close attention to this and excited about seeing progress there. And I do think that inevitably more and more autonomy will come into these types of vehicles, but I don't know when the FAA will actually certify these things.
Eric, you've probably been part of a lot of investor presentations with Joby, and you're going into the investor presentation and you're thinking to yourself, I know I'm probably going to get 80% of the questions are going to fall into this one bucket, and I'm sure you can knock them out of the park as you are today with today's podcast. What's the question when you leave that investor presentation where you think a really well-informed investor would have asked these three questions, whether it be about advanced air mobility or about Joby? What are the questions that you think are the smartest you've been asked in those discussions?
So I think that a question that maybe isn't asked enough is about kind of the iterative process of building and bringing this technology to market. And I think that maybe it's underappreciated that there is a lot of work that we have done that is essentially demonstrated by the kind of the things that we've built and tested and then learned from. That chain of design, build, test, learn, and do it again is just so incredibly important. And we really have kind of built, it's one of the reasons that we've built our vertical integrated approach is to capture that essence of design, build, and test, learn something and do it again across the company. And that is a really, really important characteristic that I think is sometimes underappreciated. When we bring people through our facilities, we really emphasize this, but I still think sometimes it's underappreciated.
And so what's the net result of a better appreciation of that? How is this shareholder going to gain from that? Is that going to be a less expensive aircraft? Will it be more reliable? Will the turn be faster? Will the price point be more affordable to a larger market?
I think that what it does is that overall stance that we've built of designing, building, testing, learning, that we're doing in the development phase, that we're going to be doing in the operation phase as well, is really a de-risking exercise in a lot of ways, because what we're doing is we're kind of building the DNA of the company in such a way that we can learn quickly, and that by learning quickly we can then deploy things, iterate things, address things that happen in a very tight loop. And we think that's an incredibly important way to both do development, but then also to operate things in the future.
How much do you worry about competition at this point of the maturity of the market?
I think that we can only control the things that we can control. And so we certainly pay attention to what other people are doing, but we have to execute against our plan. And so we are laser focused across the company, whether or not it's the team working on commercialization or the team that's working on the testing of composite coupons on a daily basis. We're just focused on executing against our plan because that's what we can control.
So presumably this Venn diagram of route densities or population densities and weather and other factors that are relevant to the concept of operation, presumably that will result in a handful of early geographies that a lot of these early UAM players will try to compete in. So what will be the differentiator for those companies to emerge as winners? And to what extent is this a winner take all market?
We think there's going to be sufficient demand across the board for multiple successful players in the market. But we do think it's really important to be the first mover, because we think that there's opportunity both to establish the right way to do things and also to engage with communities in the right way, to really build that trust with communities that this is a new type of mobility that they want to have in their community. And so that's one of the things that we're really focused on.
Eric, I would assume you talk about in your 10K that, potential $1 trillion market by 2040. And well, you quote studies in your 10K, $1 trillion market by 2040 and potentially up to 9 trillion by 2050. You're probably thinking, hey, the market's plenty large enough. And arguably, let's face it, you guys are one of the top 3 or 4 OEMs or providers in this space. So for you, it's probably all about timing. Can you last long enough, or what will be your value at the point where this becomes the true Uber Black of the sky? The sooner it happens, Joby's in a terrific spot, is my guess.
We like where we are positioned right now. We are excited about the execution that we have going on across the team. And we feel good about our position in terms of our capital position and where we sit in the market. And we're just really excited about being able to push forward and take the next steps and finish the certification and start to operate.
What do you think about the strategy that some of the large companies in aerospace and automotive are pursuing in terms of, just waiting back and entering the market later in the decade once some of these additional cards have been turned around? What do you think of their strategy, and how will they then be able to secure that customer trust and ultimately win in the market?
Yeah, it's hard to say, because every company has its own logic and reasons for decisions that they make. I do think that we can look at analogy a little bit though and look what's happened in the car market. And I think it's more or less the approach that OEMs have taken in the electric vehicle transition relative to the early leaders like Tesla, particularly in the US. And I think, there's a lot to be played out still in that market as well. But it feels like the strategy to catch up later that car OEMs have done relative to EVs, it's not clear yet that that's actually going to work. So it'll be interesting to see how that market plays out.
Does an inability for the company to meet the demand that it creates present a vulnerability or not, in the opinion of the company?
Well, I always think having more demand is a good problem to have. But I do think that we are planning in an appropriate way for multiple different scenarios. I think an example of what this means in terms of what we're doing is the way we've designed our pilot production line in Marina. I'm actually here in our facility down in Marina, California today, where we have our pilot production line. And we have our first aircraft that's being built on that line. That's actually in final assembly right now. We'll be ready pretty soon. We've worked pretty closely with Toyota in designing this production process so that it's scalable fundamentally. So we have all of the different pieces of production that we need in multiple different scales of production kind of represented in this pilot line that we're getting our production certification on. And so the ability to scale that, the mindset towards scaling that production capability is kind of built in from the beginning. And that's really one of the advantages of working with someone like Toyota that knows this better than anyone else in the world, that we've been able to bake that philosophy into the fundamentals of how we're designing our production process.
Eric, 5 to 10 years, you're going to forecast. What are you highly confident as to how the market will evolve over the next 5 to 10 years?
So I think that what we'll see initial deployments, as I mentioned earlier, of aircraft into initial launch markets. And then we'll see the development of those markets and really kind of the demonstration of utility and value on a day-to-day basis of this new form of mobility for people. And then I think that we'll see an expansion out of those initial markets into subsequent markets where we see this, as the technology matures, as we refine our network and operations, and really understand how we can playbook and expand. We'll see expansion into these additional markets, both in the U.S. and outside the U.S., where we have a lot of the similar characteristics that we think communities will be able to benefit from three-dimensional mobility.
10 years from now, are you generating more cash from the service or from the building of the aircraft?
I think that we in 10 years, it's tough to say where everything will be at, but I think with a vertically integrated approach, those two things are coupled together, and we'll be able to continue to grow and invest in developing our service and growing our markets in a way that's maximally efficient.
And what's the probability that you'll be fully autonomous in 10 years?
That's a difficult question to answer. I think in 10 years, we'll see. I would be disappointed. Maybe I'll put it that way. I'll be disappointed if in 10 years we don't see much more progress in autonomy and seeing it much more widely used than we've seen over the last 10 years.
Eric, so you have a terrific background to answer this question. What advice would you give to somebody who's building a business in advanced air mobility?
I think you have to really understand where you're adding value right now. That the market went through a pretty interesting expansion and developments with several companies, including Joby, being on the public markets now over the last few years. I think investors have understood the immense amount of capital required to bring a vehicle to market. And so understanding where you fit in the ecosystem, where you fit in the supply chain, and who the customer is for whatever the technology is you want to bring to market is incredibly important. And also understanding how it fits into the likely way the market plays out and develops, I think is a pretty key question. If I were an investor, I'd be asking anyone in this space right now.
And given where you are and the position you are in the elite company that you're with, what need do you see out there where you would say to an entrepreneur, hey, I would be looking at this area. You think there's a gap somewhere? Where would it be?
Well, we do build lots of things ourselves that we that we see as gaps. But I do think that one of the things that my team is pretty focused on is call it the operating system for the back end of both the airline and the aircraft manufacturing components of the company. And that's not something that really exists right now. The operating system that will actually allow us to deploy and operate in an on-demand context in a way that is robust and resilient to disruptions is something that is a real core thing that we're building. And so I think that others will need this as well if they're going to operate in the same way.
Eric, what's the most common misconception or misunderstanding of this topic? And we'll just call it advanced air mobility in general.
I think there's a number of people that think that it's not possible, that batteries aren't good enough to be able to actually do this mission. I still run into that on a fairly regular basis, which surprises me, to be honest. But I think that there is that impression of how could you possibly do this with batteries, et cetera. And I think that that's really not true, that batteries are good enough. Today's technology is good enough to make the business case work. And which means they're not, special batteries that you can only use 10 times before you have to replace them, right? It's actual real industrial scale batteries that have a reasonable economically useful life associated with them that exists today, and we can make it work with that.
With your pedigree, Eric, who does Eric Allison look to in this industry and say, this is a thought leader that you listen to and you give time to?
So I try to listen to everyone, to be honest. I think that you have to have an open mind, and you have to listen to people who have been in this industry for a while. I actually like the fact that on your podcast that you have a variety of guests that you bring in, both new entrants as well as people who have a long history in it. And you got to listen to naysayers. You need to listen to the people who are the cheerleaders. I think that everyone has a perspective, and to be successful, you have to be open to hearing critique, and you have to be open to new ideas, and you integrate them and synthesize it into a view of what the right way to move forward is.
Eric, what's an example of one of these conversations or insights that you've received that led to an aha moment?
I think that as I've thought more and more about electric aviation and specifically electric aviation as applied to the air taxi market that Joby's focusing on. I really see this fitting pretty almost classically into the Clayton Christensen disruptive innovation framework. That if you look at the typical metrics that people have judged performance of aircraft by over the years, it's been range is one of the big ones. And electric aviation, fundamentally, you just don't have as much range with a battery-powered aircraft as you do with a conventional power plant. But you open up new capabilities. Specifically, you open up design degrees of freedom that let you make a acoustically different type of an aircraft, as we discussed earlier. You have the ability to make an aircraft that has this acoustic signature that's now compatible with communities. And so you open up this whole new market that's simply not available, where range doesn't really matter all that much, or it doesn't matter nearly as much as it does in the traditional market. And then over time, though, the technology, batteries will get better, and then that market will grow. And I think it's really interesting to think, 10 years down the road, and what the possibilities are if I could hail an air taxi in downtown San Francisco and be in downtown LA in an hour. That, I think, is a new level of transformational capability that is kind of foreshadowed a bit by the developments of technology.
Eric, do you see a way that the drone delivery industry can play a role in building public acceptance of other forms of AAM in the future, either through the value proposition or through getting people comfortable with the impact that they make? And are there lessons that the drone industry can take from what Joby has been working on?
I think the drone industry needs to take acoustics pretty seriously too. I think that what some of the early experiments in this, I believe that Google's Wing division in Australia a few years ago ran into this. They wanted to be out in rural areas to reduce the impact of what they were doing, at least from the press reports that I read. But obviously out in rural areas, it's also very quiet. And so the acoustic signature was just amplified in that context as well. So I think that, again, taking acoustics pretty seriously from the very beginning is important in any of these industries if we want to see broad community acceptance of it.
How would you like to summarize the podcast for our listeners?
Well, I think that this is an exciting point that we're at in this industry. I got into this industry over a decade ago when it was just a few of us working in garages and labs. And I think that seeing the developments that have happened just within the last couple of years, bringing this industry to life, and seeing now the investment that's poured in and the progress that we're making, I couldn't be more excited about the road that we have ahead, or the not road that we have ahead, and to be able to offer this type of transformational mobility to people all across the world in just a few short years.
Fabulous. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you very much for your time. Feels like we could talk for hours. Really appreciate you being on the vertical space, and look forward to crossing paths with you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to the Vertical Space podcast. Reach out if there are topics that you would like us to discuss, and goodbye until the next episode. Unless mentioned, this podcast is in no way endorsing or promoting any person and or company mentioned, and all opinions within the podcast are solely that of the presenters. The Vertical Space makes no guarantees, warranty, or representation of any information given in this podcast. Any information given is for informational purposes and should be used at your own risk. This podcast is for general, educational, and entertainment purposes only.